The first assembly of the Michaelmas season at Wexbury Hall began at 9, and by 9:30 every candle in the long room had been lit twice over, because the Honorable Mrs. Fenner had insisted the first arrangement threw shadows on the wrong side of her daughter's face. 200 wax candles. 400 pounds of light burning above a floor of polished oak, above silk the color of ripe plums and silk the color of morning cream, above throats hung with garnets and pearls, and one collar of diamonds that had come out of a bank vault in Cheapside for the occasion. Beatrice Hale stood beneath all of it in a gown of pale green muslin that had been made new for her mother in the year 1804. She knew the exact age of the fabric because she had unpicked it and turned it herself 3 times at a kitchen table by a tallow candle that smoked. She knew where the weave had thinned at the left shoulder, a patch the size of a thumbprint through which the candlelight came if a person stood at the right angle, like light through a held-up leaf. She knew that the hem had been let down twice, and that the second letting down had left a faint line across the skirt, a pale ghost of the old fold which no amount of pressing had ever quite persuaded to leave. She had hoped the room would be dim. The room was not dim. "Good heavens!" said Miss Cordelia Vance, not loudly but at that particular pitch a trained voice can achieve, the one that carries across a floor without ever seeming to have been thrown. "I do believe I can see the wallpaper through her." The laugh that followed was not a roar. It was better bred than that. It moved through the near end of the room in a soft ripple, a dozen mouths behind a dozen fans, and it had the sound of water, finding a crack it had always known was there. Beatrice did not move. She had learned in 23 years of a life that had contracted around her a little more each season, that stillness was the only garment she owned that could not be seen through. At the far end of the room, near the terrace doors, a man in a dark blue coat set down a glass of wine. He had not tasted. He did not look at Miss Vance. He looked at the length of the floor between himself and the girl in the green gown, the way a man looks at a distance he intends to cross, and something in the set of his shoulders, altered by perhaps half an inch. Nobody saw it. Nobody except a footman named Talloway who had carried that man's boots for 11 years and who, watching from beside the punch table, felt the hair rise on his arms. You will want to remember the patch at the shoulder. It matters later, and not in the way she feared. The Hales had been gentlefolk once, in the way that a great many families in that county had been gentlefolk once, which is to say that there had been land, and then there had been a bad harvest and a worse decision. And then there had been a solicitor in a black coat explaining to a widow and her daughter that the estate at Little Cotton was entailed away from the female line and would pass upon the death of Beatrice's father to a second cousin they had met twice. The father had died in the March of 1811. The second cousin, Mr. Julian Ferrars, had arrived in the April, had walked through the house with his hat still on his head, and had been kind in his fashion. He had said that the widow and the girl might remain in the dower cottage at the edge of the park. He had said it in the voice of a man conferring a favor he intended to remember. They had remained. The mother had died in the winter of 1814, of a cough that a warmer house might have argued with. Beatrice had gone on living in the cottage with a woman named Prudence Gray, who had been her mother's maid at 19, and was now 61, and neither maid nor mistress, but something the language of that county had no word for. They kept hens, they sold eggs, they took in fine sewing from 3 families who paid late, and 1 family that paid promptly, and Beatrice taught the promptly paying families 2 daughters, their French verbs on Tuesdays and Thursdays for a sum that would have embarrassed a scullery maid. The work had a shape, and the shape had become her life. She rose at 5, because the hens rose at 5. She broke the ice on the trough with the heel of a flat iron kept by the door for that purpose, and the iron had worn a shallow dish in the ice crust of the trough rim. Over 4 winters, a small permanent record of a small permanent labor. She carried water. She counted eggs into a basket lined with a napkin. Her mother had hemmed. On Mondays, she walked 4 miles to the village with the basket on her hip and walked back with what the basket had earned, which in a good week was 5 shillings and in a bad week was 2, and she had learned to know the difference in her arms before she ever reached the cottage door. The sewing came in on Wednesdays. It was mostly other women's happiness. She let out the seams of gowns that had been made for girls who had since become wives and had eaten well. She took in the seams of gowns made for girls who had not. She set 112 stitches into the hem of Miss Anne Bellamy's wedding dress in a single evening, and was paid 3 shillings for it, and thanked twice, which was, she noted, twice more than most. Her hands showed all of it. They were the hands of a woman who worked, and they did not pretend otherwise. Red across the knuckles, one nail permanently ridged where a hen had taken exception to her in the spring of 1812, and when she went into rooms full of silk she kept them in her lap. Not from shame, exactly, but because she had discovered that people who saw them stopped listening to her. She was invited to the assemblies because Mr. Ferrers's mother, the elder Mrs. Ferrers, considered it a demonstration of the family's magnanimity that the dispossessed girl should be seen to be included. Beatrice understood this perfectly. She went anyway. She went because the room at the cottage was small, and the winter was long, and because somewhere in her, under everything, there lived a stubborn animal that still wanted to hear music played, by more than one instrument at a time. To Wexbury she was the charity cousin. The phrase had been coined by somebody and adopted by everybody, and it had the useful quality of sounding almost affectionate. She had learned to hear it the way one hears a clock. The man at the terrace doors was Adrian Thorne, Lord Marchbourne, and he had come into the county in the August, and by the September, the county had exhausted itself trying to decide what he was. He was 34. He had inherited Marchbourne Court from an uncle 9 months before, and had spent the intervening time doing things no landlord in that part of England had done in living memory, such as walking the tenant farms himself, in the rain, and asking the tenants questions, and then writing the answers down. He had no wife. He had no visible grief and no visible joy. He spoke rarely. And when he spoke, the sentences were short and level and left no handle by which a conversation could be picked up and carried further. The mothers of the county had decided he was proud. The daughters of the county had decided he was magnificent. Miss Vance, whose father held 4,000 a year and whose diamonds had come out of the Cheapside vault, had decided he was hers, and had said so, in a private room, to 3 friends, in a tone that did not admit of question. Beatrice had decided nothing at all about him, because deciding things about men like that was a habit she had put away with her mother's better linen. The music began. The sets formed. She stood at the edge of the room near a pillar where the light was worst, and she watched, and she permitted herself the one pleasure she never denied. She counted the steps of the dance and let her feet learn them in her slippers, where no one could see a shadow arrived at her left. Miss Hale. She turned. He was closer than she had expected. She had a confused impression of a very white cravat, and a jaw that did not move, and then she made her curtsy, and when she rose, her heart was doing something inconvenient in her throat. My lord, you are not dancing. It was not a question, it was. She thought exactly the kind of thing a man said when he had been told to be civil to the poor relation, and wished to discharge the duty in the fewest possible syllables. No, my lord. He looked at the floor, at the sets turning under the candlelight, and then back at her. Why not? Nobody had ever asked her. In 4 seasons, nobody had asked her, because everybody knew, and knowing had made the asking unnecessary and the answer unnecessary, and her presence, in the end, unnecessary. Because no one has asked me, she said. Something happened in his face. It was very small. It was the sort of movement a person might make if a door had opened somewhere behind them in a house they had believed to be empty. He did not ask her to dance. She noticed that with a flat and practiced calm. Stand nearer the fire, he said. You are cold. Then he bowed and walked away, and she stood exactly where she was, furious, in a way she could not have explained, her hands cold and her face hot, and she thought that he had told her where to stand, as though I were a chair. She did not move nearer the fire. She stood where she was for 11 minutes by the long case clock in the corner, out of what she recognized perfectly well as spite. And by the end of the 11 minutes her fingers had gone the color of candle wax, and she had begun, in a small, mortifying way, to shiver. The music went on. Sir Henry Bellamy's daughters danced twice each. The Honorable Mrs. Fenner's daughter danced 3 times and laughed at everything. Miss Vance danced 4 times and did not laugh at all, and every 4th turn of the set brought her face around toward the terrace doors and the man standing beside them, and every 4th turn she found him not looking at her, and each time the not looking cost her something she was too well trained to show. Beatrice watched all of it, and permitted herself no opinion about any of it. She had a system for these evenings. She stayed 1 hour past supper because leaving earlier was a confession, and leaving later was a hope. And 1 hour past supper had the great advantage of being simply a fact about the length of an evening. She had been operating the system for 4 seasons. It had never once failed her. 20 minutes later, she noticed that a footman had come and gone, and that the great screen which had stood beside the pillar had been shifted 6 feet to the left, and that the draught from the terrace doors, which had been running across her shoulders all evening, had stopped. She did not connect the 2 things. Not then. Shh. Prudence connected them at once. When she heard and said nothing, because she had been keeping other people's confidences for 40 years and had a professional's respect for a thing not yet ready to be said. Consider that screen for a moment. It weighed perhaps 9 stone, and it took 2 men to move it, and nobody in that room but one person had any reason at all to want it moved. Stay with her. The room will not see it for some time yet. The 2nd week of October brought rain, and the rain brought Mr. Ferrars to the Dower cottage with an umbrella and a document. He sat in the good chair, which was the only chair, and he balanced his hat on his knee, and explained in the voice of a man being reasonable that the cottage roof would require 90 pounds of work before the winter, and that he was not, he hoped she understood, a man of unlimited means, and that there was a solution which had the great advantage of costing nobody anything. He was 39, and he had wet boots, and he was not, in any melodramatic sense, a monster. He simply believed, with a serene and total certainty, that the law had given him a house and a park, and as an incidental, the disposal of the girl who came with them. "You would be mistress of Little Cawton again," he said. "The thing has a symmetry." He said it the way a man reads out a column of figures that has come to a satisfactory total. He had, she saw, thought it through. He had thought it through in the way a careful man thinks through a purchase of land, considering the drainage and the aspect and the neighbors. And he had arrived at her the way he might have arrived at a field with a good southern slope. "You have not asked me whether I like you," she said. Mr. Ferrars looked genuinely puzzled, and the puzzlement was the worst part of the whole afternoon, because it was not performed. "I have never disliked you," he said, and he plainly considered this a generous answer, and by the standards of 9 men in 10 in that county he was right. The rain came down the window in ropes. Somewhere behind the wall a hen said something and was answered. Beatrice looked at her hands, which were red at the knuckles from the eggs in the cold water, and she thought about the 90 pounds and about Prudence, who was 61, and about the fact that there was no other roof anywhere in England under which the 2 of them might go. "I am grateful for the offer," she said. "I must decline it." Mr. Ferrars put his hat back on his knee. He was not angry. He was patient, the way water is patient with stone. "You will think it over," he said. "The winter is a great persuader." He left. The rain went on. Prudence came in from the henhouse with 3 eggs in her apron, and looked at Beatrice's face and set the eggs down and said, "Well, 90 pounds, Beatrice said. "We have 11. They sat with that for a while. On the mantel, propped against the wall, stood a small square of card, on which Beatrice's father had, in the last year of his life, drawn a wren on a bare branch in brown ink. It was not a good drawing. He had not been a good artist. He had made it on a Sunday because she had said in passing that the wrens came to the kitchen window, and nobody ever looked at them. She looked at it now, as she always did when the arithmetic ran out. "There is the Ferrers' dinner on Thursday," Prudence said at last. "You are asked." "I am always asked." "You will go." Beatrice thought of the room and the candles and the fans. She thought of Miss Vance and the wallpaper. "I will go," she said. At the Ferrers' dinner, the elder Mrs. Ferrers seated Beatrice below the salt and made a small speech about family feeling, and Miss Vance, seated at the host's right hand in ice-blue silk, said to her neighbor, in the clear, carrying voice that was her chief accomplishment, "One must admire the charity cousin. She has worn the same gown for 4 seasons, and has never once apologized for it." The table laughed. 19 people. Beatrice counted them, because counting was a thing she could do with her face still. Lord Marchbourne, seated 3 places down, set his knife on the cloth. "Miss Vance," he said. The table turned. "You have used a phrase I do not know. Charity cousin. Explain it to me." Miss Vance's fan opened and did not move. It is a very particular kind of silence, the silence of 19 people discovering simultaneously that a joke has been carried into a room where it does not live. The candle flame stood straight. Somebody's chair creaked. "It is only a manner of speaking, my lord." "I see," he said, and picked up his knife, and ate. That was all. He did not eat quickly, and he did not eat slowly. He turned to the woman on his left and asked her a question about the drainage of her husband's low meadow, and she answered it, and he asked another, and within 90 seconds the table had been given permission to be a table again, and had taken it gratefully. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not look at anyone. The conversation reassembled itself around the hole he had made in it, the way water closes over a dropped stone, and by the second course the table had almost recovered its composure, and Beatrice sat below the salt with her hands in her lap, and her heart going like a bird against a window. He had not defended her. She told herself this with great firmness on the walk home, Prudence's lantern swinging between them. He had corrected a vulgarity at his own table, as any gentleman might. It was a matter of manners. It had nothing whatever to do with her. The trouble was her body, which had been listening more carefully than her mind, and which had understood, in the instant he said her tormentor's name, that a man had put himself between her and a room. Her body did not consult her about this. Her body simply knew, and went on knowing all the way home. In the dark, November came in hard. Beatrice took the eggs to market on a Tuesday, and it was on the road back, past the Marchbourne gate, that she found the boy. His name was Tom Reddy, and he was 9, and he was the second son of a tenant on the Marchbourne land, and he was sitting in the ditch with his ankle turned the wrong way and a face gone the color of skimmed milk, and he was not crying, which was worse than crying. She put the eggs down in the wet grass and forgot them. It took her 50 minutes to get him to the farmhouse because he could not bear weight, and she was 5 feet 4 inches, and he was 9 years old and heavy with it, and the road was mud, and twice she had to set him down on a stone wall and hold him upright by the shoulders while she got her breath back. She talked to him the whole way. She told him about the wrens. She told him about a hen named Duchess, who had once got into the parlor and laid an egg in a bonnet. She made him laugh twice, and by the second time his face had a little color in it, and he had stopped shaking. She did not know that a man on a gray horse had come to the top of the rise at minute 19 and had stopped there. She did not know that he had stayed at the top of the rise for the remaining 31 minutes out of sight, watching a woman in a wet green gown carry a farmer's son 1.5 miles through the mud, telling him about a hen. She did not know that he had turned his horse and gone home the long way, and had sat in his library that evening without a candle until the fire went out. What she did know, and did not think about until much later, was the last 100 yards. Tom had gone quiet by then. She had run out of hens, and run out of wrens, and had begun in desperation to tell him the plot of a novel she had read at 15 and remembered badly, and she had got the names wrong twice, and he had corrected her both times, which meant he was still listening, which meant he was still all right. His mother came out of the farmhouse door and did not scream, which Beatrice thought afterward was the bravest thing she had ever seen a woman do. They put him on the kitchen table. The bone was not broken. It was a bad turn of the ankle, and it would keep him off it for a month, and he would be entirely well by the spring. And Mrs. Burstis Reddy said, "Thank you 11 times," and offered her a chair and a cup and half a loaf. And Beatrice took the cup and refused the loaf, because the Reddys had 6 children and 1 cow. She only knew that she got home at dusk with mud to her knees, and 11 of 18 eggs unbroken, and that Prudence looked at her and said nothing and put the kettle on. 3 days later, a cart came to the cottage, with 2 men, a ladder, and 90 pounds worth of slate. There was no note. The men said only that the work was ordered and paid, and that they were to be finished before the frost. Beatrice stood in the yard with her arms folded against the cold, and watched her roof become a roof, and she felt something in her chest that she had no name for and did not like, because it was too close to hope, and hope was the one expense she had never been able to afford. Prudence, who had said nothing for 3 days, said something on the 3rd evening. "You will go up there and refuse it," she said. It was not a question, and it was not encouragement. "You will walk 2 miles in the cold and stand in a great man's house and tell him you would rather I died of the damp than be obliged to him." Beatrice put down the knife she had been peeling with. "That is not what I would be saying. It is what he will hear," Prudence went on peeling. She had hands like a map of a country nobody had ever surveyed. "I have been in service since I was 9 years old, and I have watched a great many women refuse a great many things, in order to keep hold of the only thing they had left, and I will tell you what it buys. It buys nothing. It only costs somebody else. Then what would you have me do?" "I would have you go up there," Prudence said, "and find out why he did it." She walked to Marchbourne Court that afternoon to refuse it. She got as far as the library. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, and the room was the coldest room she had ever entered that contained a fire, and there was a piano against the far wall with the lid up and a sheet of music open on the stand, and dust on the keys thick enough to hold a fingerprint. "I cannot accept it," she said. "It is not for you." He did not turn. "It is for the woman of 61 who would have spent the winter under it." That was such an efficient piece of cruelty, and such a complete piece of accuracy, that she could not think of a single word to put after it. "My lord, I have no means of repaying you. I have not asked to be repaid." Men always ask to be repaid. He turned then. She had never seen his face properly. The window light was behind him, and it did nothing kind to him. And she saw a man who was not, in fact, cold at all, and never had been, and who had been holding something so heavy for so long that all the strength he possessed was going into the holding, and there was none left over for anything else. "Some men," he said, "have already been repaid and are attempting to discharge the balance." He crossed the room. He did not touch her. He stopped near enough that she could see the pulse at his throat, and the place where he had shaved badly, high on the jaw, as though his hand had not been steady that morning, and she understood with a lurch that her own breathing had gone shallow, and that he could probably hear it. Neither of them moved. She should have stepped back. There was no chaperone, no maid, no open door. There was a woman and a man and a cold library and a distance of perhaps 14 inches. And every rule she had ever been taught said, "Step back." Her feet did not consult her either. "The piano," she said, because she had to say something. "It is out of tune." "Yes, it has been out of tune for a long time." 9 months, he said. And then, because she had asked nothing, and he answered anyway, in a voice she had to lean in to hear, "My sister played it, Eleanor. She wrote to me twice from Bath that summer, and I did not answer either letter, because I was in London and I was busy, and there would be time. She died in the September. There was not time." He said the name once. He did not say it again. "I came into this house in the November, and the music was still on the stand where she left it, halfway through. I have not been able to close the lid. The clock in the hall struck 4. That is the whole of it," he said. "You may take it back to the county and make what use of it you like." Beatrice looked at the dust on the keys and at the sheet of music stopped mid-phrase, and at the man in front of her who had just handed her the only thing he owned that could be used against him, and she thought that he had not had to tell her that. "I shall not tell anyone," she said. "I know. How do you know?" And he said quite simply, "Because I watched you carry Tom Reddy 1.5 miles and never once tell him you were tired." The floor did not move. It only felt as though it had. She walked home in the dark. Her hands were shaking, and it was not the cold. She said his sister's name once, silently, as one says a thing to be sure of it, and then she put it away where nothing would find it. Behind her in the library, a man stood a long while beside a piano, and did not close the lid. Miss Vance was not a fool, and she had been watching. She had seen the screen moved at the assembly. She had seen the knife set down at the Ferrers' table. She had heard, from a servant with a brother on the Marchbourne land, about Slate. She went to the elder Mrs. Ferrers, and Mrs. Ferrers went to her son, and by the middle of December there was a plan. And the plan had the shape all such plans have. It did not require anybody to do anything wicked. It required only that everyone do what they already wished to do, in the right order, in front of enough people. The Marchbourne Christmas ball was announced for the 22nd, and it would be the first entertainment given at the court in 9 years. 300 cards went out. The county went very nearly mad. And a card came to the Dower cottage, and Prudence brought it in on the tea tray, as though it were something that might bite. "You will need a gown," Prudence said. "I have a gown, Beatrice." "I have a gown," Beatrice said, and heard her own voice go hard and was ashamed of it, and could not help it. "I have had that gown for 4 seasons, and it has never once let me down. And I will not go into that house on his charity, dressed in something bought with his money. I have very little left. I have that." Prudence set the tray down. "Then we turn the shoulder," she said again. They turned the shoulder. It took 2 evenings. The patch was still a patch, and the ghost line still crossed the skirt. And on the night of the 22nd, Beatrice Hale walked into a house lit by 1,000 candles, wearing a gown that had been new when Napoleon was still an interesting rumor. Miss Vance had chosen scarlet. She stood at the foot of the great stair with the elder Mrs. Ferrers at her elbow and the diamonds on her throat, and when Beatrice came in, she did not lower her voice at all. "There she is," said Miss Vance to the entire hall. "The charity cousin. Do look at the shoulder. It is quite transparent. One does wonder what she thinks she is here for." And this time, the laugh was not a ripple. It was the whole hall, 300 people. And it broke over Beatrice like something physical, and she stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and understood that she had been invited for precisely this. Mr. Ferrers appeared at her elbow, with a glass of wine and a face full of gentle regret. "You see how it is," he said quietly. "It need not be like this. Say the word tonight, and it stops. I will announce it before we sit down, and not one of them will ever laugh at you again." That was the trap. That was the whole architecture of it, built by 3 people over 6 weeks, and it had taken her 40 seconds to walk into the middle of it. She looked at the hall. 300 faces, all of them turned, all of them delighted, and among them not one that would take her side, because taking her side had never in her whole life been of any use to anybody. She saw the Bellamy girls whose hems she had sewn. She saw the Honorable Mrs. Fenner, who had once accepted a dozen of her eggs as a gift and had never acknowledged it. She saw a man she had danced with at 17, in another life, in a gown that had been new, who was looking at the ceiling with great attention. And she understood, standing there with her hand on the doorframe, and her heart going somewhere, it had no business going, that this was not cruelty. Cruelty would have been easier to survive. This was arithmetic. 300 people had done a sum about her, years ago, and the sum had come out, and they were not laughing at her, because they hated her. They were laughing because the answer was funny, and they had all got it right. She set the wine down untouched. "No," she said. And she turned and walked, not out of the house, but into it, straight down the length of that hall through the middle of the laughter, because the only thing left to her was to be seen leaving in her own time and by her own legs, and she got 11 steps. On the 11th step, the laughter stopped. It did not fade. It stopped, the way a room stops when the ceiling makes a noise, and Beatrice, who had her eyes fixed on the doors at the far end and was not going to look at anything else ever again, became aware of a movement to her right at the top of the stairs. Lord Marchbourne came down. He came down slowly. He was not hurrying. And the not hurrying was somehow the most frightening thing about it. He reached the bottom and he crossed the marble to her, and the crowd came apart in front of him like grass. And he stopped 1 pace away and looked at her. And then he did the only thing that no one in that hall had prepared for. He bowed to her. Not the small inclination a peer gives a country miss. He bowed as a man bows to a woman of the first rank in the presence of the whole world, low, and held it. And the silence that fell on Marchbourne Court in that moment had a weight you could feel in the teeth. He straightened. He offered his hand. "Miss Hale opens my house tonight." 8 words. He did not raise his voice, and 300 people heard every syllable, and nobody in that hall ever forgot them. Miss Vance's fan slipped in her fingers and struck the marble with a small, clear sound. She looked at the hand. It was not a small gesture, and it was not a private one. There were 300 people in that hall, and every one of them was going to remember, for the rest of their lives, what she did in the next second, and so was she. Beatrice put her hand in his. What happened next happened without music, because the orchestra had forgotten it was an orchestra, and it was perhaps 4 seconds before the first violin remembered, and the rest came in ragged behind him. He led her to the head of the floor. The county stood back and made a space, and the space was the shape of an apology, though not one of them could have said so. "My lord," she said very low, as his hand came to her waist, "you cannot undo this." "No," he said, "I cannot." And there, in front of everybody, with the candlelight coming through the thin place at her shoulder like light through a leaf, he looked at the patch and then at her face, and he said, so quietly that only she heard it, "I have wanted you since the night you told me no one had asked. I have been a coward for 11 weeks." Her hand tightened on his. Her whole body had gone bright and unsteady, and she could not get enough air. And she thought, with the last clear corner of her mind, that if he let go of her, she would go down on the marble. He did not let go. Behind them, the elder Mrs. My Ferrars had begun to explain something to somebody, in a voice that had lost its edges. Miss Vance had reached the terrace doors. And Mr. reached. Ferrars stood alone in the middle of a hall in which he had just become, permanently and irrevocably, a man whom a duke's equal had declined to notice. The county did the rest without being asked. By the third dance, the Vances' carriage had been called. By supper, 4 separate women had recalled aloud that they had always thought Miss Hale had a very fine profile. By January, there was not a household in the county that would receive Mr. Drulla. Ferrars, before noon, and by the March, having found the county cold and the shooting poor, he sold the little cotton lease to a man from Norwich and went to live in Bath. Beatrice took no pleasure in it. She had expected to. She found when it came that watching a man lose the only thing he had was not a dish she had any appetite for, and she said so once to Adrian, and he said no. It is not a triumph. It is only a correction. And they did not speak of it again. The county did not, as she had expected, punish her for it. That was the thing she had never understood about the county until that winter, and the thing Prudence had understood all along. The county had never held an opinion of its own in its life. It had only ever repeated the last one it was given loudly enough, and on the 22nd of December, in that hall, it had been given a new one by the only man in 3 parishes whose opinion it was obliged to keep, Mrs. Gatteray. Fenner called at the cottage on the 4th of January, and drank tea in the good chair and admired the hens. They were married in the April, in the small church at Cawton, with 11 people present. She wore the green gown. There had been an argument about it, conducted over 3 weeks, and won by her in the end, and on the morning of the wedding, Prudence Gray dressed her in it at the kitchen table by a window full of gray April light, and turned the thin shoulder to the window and looked at it for a long moment. "Your mother stood up in this," Prudence said. "I know. She would have had something to say about the shoulder. She would have said to stand with my back to the light." Prudence laughed and cried a little and then stopped both, and pinned the last pin. The following winter came in with snow. It began in the afternoon of the 18th of December, and by evening it had put a hand over the whole county, and Marchbourne Court, which had been the coldest house in 3 parishes, sat in the middle of it with fires in 11 rooms, and a smell of orange peel in the hall. Purr. Beatrice sat on the library floor, with her back against a chair leg. There was a fire. There was a dog, a graceless brown thing that had come from the Ready farm at Michaelmas, and had never once been told it might not come into the library, and consequently did not know it. Tom 10 now walked without a limp, and had eaten 4 mince pies, and been sent home. Adrian was at the piano. It had been tuned in the July. He was not a good player. He was, in fact, an indifferent one, and he knew it, and he played anyway, in the evenings, badly. And the badness of it was the most private thing she had ever been given. He was playing the sheet that had been on the stand. He had learned it that autumn, a phrase at a time, in the mornings with the door shut. And she had never once let him know that the door did not fit its frame, and that she had heard every wrong note of it from the corridor since October. He got the middle passage wrong, as he always got the middle passage wrong, and swore under his breath in a manner not at all consistent with his rank, and went back 4 bars and took it again. Tonight he played it through to the last bar. The last bar arrived. The piece ended where it had always been going to end, and the room was quiet. And Beatrice, on the floor with her back against the chair leg, found that she was holding her breath, and had been holding it for some time. He closed the lid. Then he came and sat on the floor beside his wife, which no lord in that county had ever done in the history of the county, and the dog reorganized itself across both their feet. On the mantel above them, in a small frame he had made her let him buy, a wren sat on a bare branch in brown ink, badly drawn, by a man 10 years dead, who had noticed that nobody ever looked at them. Outside, the snow went on falling in the dark, and the light from the fire came through the thin place at her shoulder, and neither of them moved to mend it. "Thank you for staying to the end,"